Chapter 7 through 12 of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 7. Sunday was a day crowded with incident. Mr. Carey was accustomed to say that he was the only man in his parish who worked 7 days a week. The household got up half an hour earlier than usual. No lying abed for a poor parson on the day of rest, Mr. Carey remarked as Mary Ann knocked at the door punctually at 8. It took Mrs. Carey longer to dress, and she got down to breakfast at 9, a little breathless, only just before her husband. Mr. Carey's boots stood in front of the fire to warm. Prayers were longer than usual, and the breakfast more substantial. After breakfast the vicar cut thin slices of bread for the communion, and Philip was privileged to cut off the crust. He was sent to the study to fetch a marble paper-weight, with which Mr. Carey pressed the bread till it was thin and pulpy, and then it was cut into small squares. The amount was regulated by the weather. On a very bad day few people came to church, and on a very fine one, though many came, few stayed for communion. There were most when it was dry enough to make the walk to church pleasant, but not so fine that people wanted to hurry away. Then Mrs. Carey brought the communion plate out of the safe which stood in the pantry, and the vicar polished it with a chamois leather. At 10 the fly drove up, and Mr. Carey got into his boots. Mrs. Carey took several minutes to put on her bonnet, during which the vicar, in a voluminous cloak, stood in the hall with just such an expression on his face as would have become an early Christian about to be led into the arena. It was extraordinary that after 30 years of marriage his wife could not be ready in time on Sunday morning. At last she came, in black satin. The vicar did not like colours in a clergyman's wife at any time, but on Sundays he was determined that she should wear black. Now and then, in conspiracy with Miss Graves, she ventured a white feather or a pink rose in her bonnet, but the vicar insisted that it should disappear. He said he would not go to church with a scarlet woman. Mrs. Carey sighed as a woman, but obeyed as a wife. They were about to step into the carriage when the vicar remembered that no one had given him his egg. They knew that he must have an egg for his voice. There were 2 women in the house, and no one had the least regard for his comfort. Mrs. Carey scolded Mary Ann, and Mary Ann answered that she could not think of everything. She hurried away to fetch an egg, and Mrs. Carey beat it up in a glass of sherry. The vicar swallowed it at a gulp. The communion plate was stowed in the carriage, and they set off. The fly came from the Red Lion and had a peculiar smell of stale straw. They drove with both windows closed, so that the vicar should not catch cold. The sexton was waiting at the porch to take the communion plate, and while the vicar went to the vestry, Mrs. Carey and Philip settled themselves in the vicarage pew. Mrs. Carey placed in front of her the 6-penny bit she was accustomed to put in the plate, and gave Philip 3 pence for the same purpose. The church filled up gradually, and the service began. Philip grew bored during the sermon, but if he fidgeted, Mrs. Carey put a gentle hand on his arm and looked at him reproachfully. He regained interest when the final hymn was sung, and Mr. Graves passed round with the plate. When everyone had gone, Mrs. Carey went into Miss Graves' pew to have a few words with her while they were sitting for the gentlemen, and Philip went to the vestry. His uncle, the curate, and Mr. Graves were still in their surplices. Mr. Carey gave him the remains of the consecrated bread, and told him he might eat it. He had been accustomed to eat it himself, as it seemed blasphemous to throw it away, but Philip's keen appetite relieved him from the duty. Then they counted the money. It consisted of pennies, 6 pences, and 3-penny bits. There were always 2 single shillings, one put in the plate by the vicar, and the other by Mr. Graves, and sometimes there was a florin. Mr. Graves told the vicar who had given this. It was always a stranger to Blackstable, and Mr. Carey wondered who he was. But Miss Graves had observed the rash act, and was able to tell Mrs. Carey that the stranger came from London, was married, and had children. During the drive home, Mrs. Carey passed the information on, and the vicar made up his mind to call on him and ask for a subscription to the Additional Curates Society. Mr. Carey asked if Philip had behaved properly, and Mrs. Carey remarked that Mrs. Wigram had a new mantle, Mr. Cox was not in church, and somebody thought that Miss Phillips was engaged. When they reached the vicarage they all felt that they deserved a substantial dinner. When this was over, Mrs. Carey went to her room to rest, and Mr. Carey lay down on the sofa in the drawing-room for 40 winks. They had tea at 5, and the vicar ate an egg to support himself for evensong. Mrs. Carey did not go to this so that Mary Ann might, but she read the service through and the hymns. Mr. Carey walked to church in the evening, and Philip limped along by his side. The walk through the darkness along the country road strangely impressed him, and the church with all its lights in the distance, coming gradually nearer, seemed very friendly. At first he was shy with his uncle, but little by little grew used to him, and he would slip his hand in his uncle's and walk more easily for the feeling of protection. They had supper when they got home. Mr. Carey's slippers were waiting for him on a footstool in front of the fire, and by their side Philip's, one the shoe of a small boy, the other misshapen and odd. He was dreadfully tired when he went up to bed, and he did not resist when Mary Ann undressed him. She kissed him after she tucked him up, and he began to love her. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. Philip had led always the solitary life of an only child, and his loneliness at the vicarage was no greater than it had been when his mother lived. He made friends with Mary Ann. She was a chubby little person of 35, the daughter of a fisherman, and had come to the vicarage at 18. It was her first place, and she had no intention of leaving it. But she held a possible marriage as a rod over the timid heads of her master and mistress. Her father and mother lived in a little house off Harbour Street, and she went to see them on her evenings out. Her stories of the sea touched Philip's imagination, and the narrow alleys round the harbour grew rich with the romance which his young fancy lent them. One evening he asked whether he might go home with her, but his aunt was afraid that he might catch something, and his uncle said that evil communications corrupted good manners. He disliked the fisher folk, who were rough, uncouth, and went to chapel. But Philip was more comfortable in the kitchen than in the dining room, and whenever he could, he took his toys and played there. His aunt was not sorry. She did not like disorder, and though she recognized that boys must be expected to be untidy, she preferred that he should make a mess in the kitchen. If he fidgeted, his uncle was apt to grow restless and say it was high time he went to school. Mrs. Carey thought Philip very young for this, and her heart went out to the motherless child. But her attempts to gain his affection were awkward, and the boy, feeling shy, received her demonstrations with so much sullenness that she was mortified. Sometimes she heard his shrill voice raised in laughter in the kitchen, but when she went in, he grew suddenly silent, and he flushed darkly when Mary Ann explained the joke. Mrs. Carey could not see anything amusing in what she heard, and she smiled with constraint. "He seems happier with Mary Ann than with us, William," she said when she returned to her sewing. "One can see he's been very badly brought up. He wants licking into shape." On the second Sunday after Philip arrived an unlucky incident occurred. Mr. Carey had retired as usual after dinner for a little snooze in the drawing-room, but he was in an irritable mood and could not sleep. Josiah Graves that morning had objected strongly to some candlesticks with which the vicar had adorned the altar. He had bought them second-hand in Tercanbury, and he thought they looked very well, but Josiah Graves said they were popish. This was a taunt that always aroused the vicar. He had been at Oxford during the movement which ended in the secession from the established church of Edward Manning, and he felt a certain sympathy for the Church of Rome. He would willingly have made the service more ornate than had been usual in the Low Church parish of Blackstable, and in his secret soul he yearned for processions and lighted candles. He drew the line at incense. He hated the word Protestant. He called himself a Catholic. He was accustomed to say that Papists required an epithet. They were Roman Catholic, but the Church of England was Catholic in the best, the fullest, and the noblest sense of the term. He was pleased to think that his shaven face gave him the look of a priest, and in his youth he had possessed an aesthetic air which added to the impression. He often related that on one of his holidays in Boulogne, one of those holidays upon which his wife, for economy's sake, did not accompany him, when he was sitting in a church, the Curé had come up to him and invited him to preach a sermon. He dismissed his curates when they married, having decided views on the celibacy of the unbeneficed clergy. But when at an election the Liberals had written on his garden fence in large blue letters, "This way to Rome," he had been very angry, and threatened to prosecute the leaders of the Liberal party in Blackstable. He made up his mind now that nothing Josiah Graves said would induce him to remove the candlesticks from the altar, and he muttered Bismarck to himself once or twice irritably. Suddenly he heard an unexpected noise. He pulled the handkerchief off his face, got up from the sofa on which he was lying, and went into the dining room. Philip was seated on the table with all his bricks around him. He had built a monstrous castle, and some defect in the foundation had just brought the structure down in noisy ruin. "What are you doing with those bricks, Philip? You know you're not allowed to play games on Sunday." Philip stared at him for a moment with frightened eyes, and, as his habit was, flushed deeply. "I always used to play at home," he answered. "I'm sure your dear mamma never allowed you to do such a wicked thing as that." Philip did not know it was wicked, but if it was, he did not wish it to be supposed that his mother had consented to it. He hung his head and did not answer. "Don't you know it's very, very wicked to play on Sunday? What do you suppose it's called the day of rest for? You're going to church tonight, and how can you face your Maker when you've been breaking one of his laws in the afternoon?" Mr. Carey told him to put the bricks away at once, and stood over him while Philip did so. "You're a very naughty boy," he repeated. "Think of the grief you're causing your poor mother in heaven." Philip felt inclined to cry, but he had an instinctive disinclination to letting other people see his tears, and he clenched his teeth to prevent the sobs from escaping. Mr. Carey sat down in his armchair and began to turn over the pages of a book. Philip stood at the window. The vicarage was set back from the high road to Tercanbury, and from the dining room one saw a semicircular strip of lawn, and then as far as the horizon green fields. Sheep were grazing in them. The sky was forlorn and gray. Philip felt infinitely unhappy. Presently Mary Ann came in to lay the tea, and Aunt Louisa descended the stairs. "Have you had a nice little nap, William?" she asked. "No," he answered. "Philip made so much noise that I couldn't sleep a wink." This was not quite accurate, for he had been kept awake by his own thoughts, and Philip, listening sullenly, reflected that he had only made a noise once, and there was no reason why his uncle should not have slept before or after. When Mrs. Carey asked for an explanation, the vicar narrated the facts. "He hasn't even said he was sorry," he finished. "Oh, Philip, I'm sure you're sorry," said Mrs. Carey, anxious that the child should not seem wickeder to his uncle than need be. Philip did not reply. He went on munching his bread and butter. He did not know what power it was in him that prevented him from making any expression of regret. He felt his ears tingling. He was a little inclined to cry, but no word would issue from his lips. "You needn't make it worse by sulking," said Mr. Carey. Tea was finished in silence. Mr. Carey looked at Philip surreptitiously now and then, but the vicar elaborately ignored him. When Philip saw his uncle go upstairs to get ready for church, he went into the hall and got his hat and coat, but when the vicar came downstairs and saw him, he said, "I don't wish you to go to church tonight, Philip. I don't think you're in a proper frame of mind to enter the house of God." Philip did not say a word. He felt it was a deep humiliation that was placed upon him, and his cheeks reddened. He stood silently, watching his uncle put on his broad hat and his voluminous cloak. Mrs. Carey, as usual, went to the door to see him off. Then she turned to Philip. "Never mind, Philip. You won't be a naughty boy next Sunday, will you? And then your uncle will take you to church with him in the evening." She took off his coat and hat and led him into the dining room. "Shall you and I read the service together, Philip, and we'll sing the hymns at the harmonium? Would you like that?" Philip shook his head decidedly. Mrs. Carey was taken aback. If he would not read the evening service with her, she did not know what to do with him. "Then what would you like to do until your uncle comes back?" she asked helplessly. Philip broke his silence at last. "I want to be left alone," he said. "Philip, how can you say anything so unkind? Don't you know that your uncle and I only want your good? Don't you love me at all?" "I hate you. I wish you was dead." Mrs. Carey gasped. He said the words so savagely that it gave her quite a start. She had nothing to say. She sat down in her husband's chair, and as she thought of her desire to love the friendless crippled boy, and her eager wish that he should love her, she was a barren woman, and even though it was clearly God's will that she should be childless, she could scarcely bear to look at little children sometimes, her heart ached so. The tears rose to her eyes and one by one slowly rolled down her cheeks. Philip watched in amazement. She took out her handkerchief, and now she cried without restraint. Suddenly Philip realized that she was crying because of what he had said, and he was sorry. He went up to her silently and kissed her. It was the first kiss he had ever given her without being asked. And the poor lady, so small in her black satin, shriveled up and sallow, with her funny corkscrew curls, took the little boy on her lap and put her arms around him and wept as though her heart would break. But her tears were partly tears of happiness, for she felt that the strangeness between them was gone. She loved him now with a new love, because he had made her suffer. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9. On the following Sunday, when the vicar was making his preparations to go into the drawing-room for his nap, all the actions of his life were conducted with ceremony, and Mrs. Carey was about to go upstairs, Philip asked, "What shall I do if I'm not allowed to play?" "Can't you sit still for once and be quiet?" "I can't sit still till tea time." Mr. Carey looked out the window, but it was cold and raw, and he could not suggest that Philip should go out into the garden. "I know what you can do. You can learn by heart the collect for the day." He took the prayer book which was used for prayers from the harmonium, and turned the pages till he came to the place he wanted. "It's not a long one. If you can say it without a mistake when I come in to tea, you shall have the top of my egg." Mrs. Carey drew up Philip's chair to the dining-room table. They had bought him a high chair by now, and placed the book in front of him. "The devil finds work for idle hands to do," said Mr. Carey. He put some more coals on the fire so that there should be a cheerful blaze when he came in to tea, and went into the drawing-room. He loosened his collar, arranged the cushions, and settled himself comfortably on the sofa. But, thinking the drawing-room a little chilly, Mrs. Carey brought him a rug from the hall. She put it over his legs and tucked it round his feet. She drew the blinds so that the light should not offend his eyes, and since he had closed them already, went out of the room on tiptoe. The vicar was at peace with himself to-day, and in 10 minutes he was asleep. He snored softly. It was the 6th Sunday after Epiphany, and the collect began with the words, "O God, whose blessed Son was manifested that he might destroy the works of the devil, and make us the sons of God, and heirs of eternal life." Philip read it through. He could make no sense of it. He began saying the words aloud to himself, but many of them were unknown to him, and the construction of the sentence was strange. He could not get more than 2 lines in his head, and his attention was constantly wandering. There were fruit trees trained on the walls of the vicarage, and a long twig beat now and then against the window pane. Sheep grazed stolidly in the field beyond the garden. It seemed as though there were knots inside his brain. Then panic seized him that he would not know the words by tea time, and he kept on whispering them to himself quickly. He did not try to understand, but merely to get them parrot-like into his memory. Mrs. Carey could not sleep that afternoon, and by 4 o'clock she was so wide awake that she came downstairs. She thought she would hear Philip his collect so that he should make no mistakes when he said it to his uncle. His uncle then would be pleased. He would see that the boy's heart was in the right place. But when Mrs. Carey came to the dining-room and was about to go in, she heard a sound that made her stop suddenly. Her heart gave a little jump. She turned away and quietly slipped out of the front door. She walked round the house till she came to the dining-room window, and then cautiously looked in. Philip was still sitting on the chair she had put him in, but his head was on the table, buried in his arms, and he was sobbing desperately. She saw the convulsive movement of his shoulders. Mrs. Carey was frightened. A thing that had always struck her about the child was that he seemed so collected. She had never seen him cry, and now she realized that his calmness was some instinctive shame of showing his feelings. He hid himself to weep. Without thinking that her husband disliked being wakened suddenly, she burst into the drawing-room. "William, William," she said, "the boy's crying as though his heart will break." Mr. Carey sat up and disentangled himself from the rug about his legs. "What's he got to cry about?" "I don't know. Oh, William, we can't let the boy be unhappy. Do you think it's our fault? If we'd had children, we'd have known what to do." Mr. Carey looked at her in perplexity. He felt extraordinarily helpless. "He can't be crying because I gave him the collect to learn. It's not more than 10 lines." "Don't you think I might take him some picture books to look at, William? There are some of the Holy Land. There couldn't be anything wrong in that." "Very well, I don't mind." Mrs. Carey went into the study. To collect books was Mr. Carey's only passion, and he never went into Tercanbury without spending an hour or two in the second-hand shop. He always brought back 4 or 5 musty volumes. He never read them, for he had long lost the habit of reading, but he liked to turn the pages, look at the illustrations if they were illustrated, and mend the bindings. He welcomed wet days because on them he could stay at home without pangs of conscience, and spend the afternoon with white of egg and a glue pot, patching up the Russia leather of some battered quarto. He had many volumes of old travels with steel engravings, and Mrs. Carey quickly found 2 which described Palestine. She coughed elaborately at the door so that Philip should have time to compose himself. She felt that he would be humiliated if she came upon him in the midst of his tears. Then she rattled the door handle. When she went in, Philip was poring over the prayer book, hiding his eyes with his hands so that she might not see he had been crying. "Do you know the collect yet?" she said. He did not answer for a moment, and she felt that he did not trust his voice. She was oddly embarrassed. "I can't learn it by heart," he said at last, with a gasp. "Oh, well, never mind," she said. "You needn't. I've got some picture books for you to look at. Come and sit on my lap and we'll look at them together." Philip slipped off his chair and limped over to her. He looked down so that she should not see his eyes. She put her arms round him. "Look," she said, "that's the place where our blessed Lord was born." She showed him an Eastern town with flat roofs and cupolas and minarets. In the foreground was a group of palm trees, and under them were resting 2 Arabs and some camels. Philip passed his hands over the picture as if he wanted to feel the houses and the loose habiliments of the nomads. "Read what it says," he asked. Mrs. Carey, in her even voice, read the opposite page. It was a romantic narrative of some Eastern traveller of the 30s, pompous maybe, but fragrant with the emotion with which the East came to the generation that followed Byron and Chateaubriand. In a moment or two Philip interrupted her. "I want to see another picture." When Mary Ann came in and Mrs. Carey rose to help her lay the cloth, Philip took the book in his hands and hurried through the illustrations. It was with difficulty that his aunt induced him to put the book down for tea. He had forgotten his horrible struggle to get the collect by heart. He had forgotten his tears. Next day it was raining, and he asked for the book again. Mrs. Carey gave it to him joyfully. Talking over his future with her husband, she had found that both desired him to take orders, and this eagerness for the book, which described places hallowed by the presence of Jesus, seemed a good sign. It looked as though the boy's mind addressed itself naturally to holy things. But in a day or two he asked for more books. Mr. Carey took him into his study, showed him the shelf in which he kept illustrated works, and chose for him one that dealt with Rome. Philip took it greedily. The pictures led him to a new amusement. He began to read the page before and the page after each engraving to find out what it was about, and soon he lost all interest in his toys. Then, when no one was near, he took out books for himself, and perhaps because the first impression on his mind was made by an Eastern town, he found his chief amusement in those which described the Levant. His heart beat with the excitement at the pictures of mosques and rich palaces, but there was one, in a book on Constantinople, which peculiarly stirred his imagination. It was called The Hall of the Thousand Columns. It was a Byzantine cistern, which the popular fancy had endowed with fantastic vastness, and the legend which he read told that a boat was always moored at the entrance to tempt the unwary, but no traveller venturing into the darkness had ever been seen again. And Philip wondered whether the boat went on for ever through one pillared alley after another, or came at last to some strange mansion. One day a good fortune befell him, for he hit upon Lane's translation of The Thousand Nights and a Night. He was captured first by the illustrations, and then he began to read, to start with, the stories that dealt with magic, and then the others. And those he liked he read again and again. He could think of nothing else. He forgot the life about him. He had to be called 2 or 3 times before he would come to his dinner. Insensibly he formed the most delightful habit in the world, the habit of reading. He did not know that thus he was providing himself with a refuge from all the distress of life. He did not know either that he was creating for himself an unreal world which would make the real world of every day a source of bitter disappointment. Presently he began to read other things. His brain was precocious. His aunt and uncle, seeing that he occupied himself and neither worried nor made a sound, ceased to trouble themselves about him. Mr. Carey had so many books that he did not know them, and as he read little he forgot the odd lots he had bought at one time and another because they were cheap. Haphazard among the sermons and homilies, the travels, the lives of the saints, the fathers, the histories of the church, were old-fashioned novels, and these Philip at last discovered. He chose them by their titles, and the first he read was The Lancashire Witches, and then he read The Admirable Crichton, and then many more. Whenever he started a book with 2 solitary travellers riding along the brink of a desperate ravine, he knew he was safe. The summer was come now, and the gardener, an old sailor, made him a hammock and fixed it up for him in the branches of a weeping willow. And here for long hours he lay, hidden from anyone who might come to the vicarage, reading passionately. Time passed, and it was July. August came. On Sundays the church was crowded with strangers, and the collection at the offertory often amounted to £2. Neither the vicar nor Mrs. Carey went out of the garden much during this period, for they disliked strange faces, and they looked upon the visitors from London with aversion. The house opposite was taken for 6 weeks by a gentleman who had 2 little boys, and he sent in to ask if Philip would like to go and play with them. But Mrs. Carey returned a polite refusal. She was afraid that Philip would be corrupted by little boys from London. He was going to be a clergyman, and it was necessary that he should be preserved from contamination. She liked to see in him an infant Samuel. Chapter 10. The Careys made up their mind to send Philip to King's School at Tercanbury. The neighbouring clergy sent their sons there. It was united by long tradition to the cathedral. Its headmaster was an honorary canon, and a past headmaster was the archdeacon. Boys were encouraged there to aspire to holy orders, and the education was such as might prepare an honest lad to spend his life in God's service. A preparatory school was attached to it, and to this it was arranged that Philip should go. Mr. Carey took him into Tercanbury one Thursday afternoon towards the end of September. All day Philip had been excited and rather frightened. He knew little of school life but what he had read in the stories of the boys' own paper. He had also read Eric, or Little by Little. When they got out of the train at Tercanbury, Philip felt sick with apprehension, and during the drive into the town sat pale and silent. The high brick wall in front of the school gave it the look of a prison. There was a little door in it, which opened on their ringing, and a clumsy, untidy man came out and fetched Philip's tin trunk and his play box. They were shown into the drawing-room. It was filled with massive, ugly furniture, and the chairs of the suite were placed round the walls with a forbidding rigidity. They waited for the headmaster. "What's Mr. Watson like?" asked Philip after a while. "You'll see for yourself." There was another pause. Mr. Carey wondered why the headmaster did not come. Presently Philip made an effort and spoke again. "Tell him I've got a club foot," he said. Before Mr. Carey could speak, the door burst open and Mr. Watson swept into the room. To Philip he seemed gigantic. He was a man of over 6 feet high and broad, with enormous hands and a great red beard. He talked loudly in a jovial manner, but his aggressive cheerfulness struck terror in Philip's heart. He shook hands with Mr. Carey and then took Philip's small hand in his. "Well, young fellow, are you glad to come to school?" he shouted. Philip reddened and found no word to answer. "How old are you?" "9," said Philip. "You must say 'sir,'" said his uncle. "I expect you've got a good lot to learn," the headmaster bellowed cheerily. To give the boy confidence, he began to tickle him with rough fingers. Philip, feeling shy and uncomfortable, squirmed under his touch. "I've put him in the small dormitory for the present. You'll like that, won't you?" he added to Philip. "Only 8 of you in there. You won't feel so strange." Then the door opened and Mrs. Watson came in. She was a dark woman with black hair, neatly parted in the middle. She had curiously thick lips and a small round nose. Her eyes were large and black. There was a singular coldness in her appearance. She seldom spoke and smiled more seldom still. Her husband introduced Mr. Carey to her, and then gave Philip a friendly push towards her. "This is a new boy, Helen. His name's Carey." Without a word she shook hands with Philip, and then sat down, not speaking, while the headmaster asked Mr. Carey how much Philip knew and what books he had been working with. The vicar of Blackstable was a little embarrassed by Mr. Watson's boisterous heartiness, and in a moment or two got up. "I think I'd better leave Philip with you now." "That's all right," said Mr. Watson. "He'll be safe with me. He'll get on like a house on fire. Won't you, young fellow?" Without waiting for an answer from Philip, the big man burst into a great bellow of laughter. Mr. Carey kissed Philip on the forehead and went away. "Come along, young fellow," shouted Mr. Watson. "I'll show you the schoolroom." He swept out of the drawing-room with giant strides, and Philip hurriedly limped along behind him. He was taken into a long bare room with 2 tables that ran along its whole length. On each side of them were wooden forms. "Nobody much here yet," said Mr. Watson. "I'll just show you the playground, and then I'll leave you to shift for yourself." Mr. Watson led the way. Philip found himself in a large playground with high brick walls on 3 sides of it. On the 4th side was an iron railing through which you saw a vast lawn, and beyond this some of the buildings of King's School. One small boy was wandering disconsolately, kicking up the gravel as he walked. "Hello, Venning!" shouted Mr. Watson. "When did you turn up?" The small boy came forward and shook hands. "Here's a new boy. He's older and bigger than you, so don't you bully him." The headmaster glared amicably at the 2 children, filling them with fear by the roar of his voice, and then, with a guffaw, left them. "What's your name?" "Carey." "What's your father?" "He's dead." "Oh. Does your mother wash?" "My mother's dead, too." Philip thought this answer would cause the boy a certain awkwardness, but Venning was not to be turned from his facetiousness for so little. "Well, did she wash?" he went on. "Yes," said Philip indignantly. "She was a washerwoman, then?" "No, she wasn't." "Then she didn't wash." The little boy crowed with delight at the success of his dialectic. Then he caught sight of Philip's feet. "What's the matter with your foot?" Philip instinctively tried to withdraw it from sight. He hid it behind the one which was whole. "I've got a club foot," he answered. "How did you get it?" "I've always had it." "Let's have a look." "No." "Don't then." The little boy accompanied the words with a sharp kick on Philip's shin, which Philip did not expect, and thus could not guard against. The pain was so great that it made him gasp, but greater than the pain was the surprise. He did not know why Venning kicked him. He had not the presence of mind to give him a black eye. Besides, the boy was smaller than he, and he had read in the boy's own paper that it was a mean thing to hit anyone smaller than yourself. While Philip was nursing his shin, a third boy appeared, and his tormentor left him. In a little while he noticed that the pair were talking about him, and he felt they were looking at his feet. He grew hot and uncomfortable. But others arrived, a dozen together, and then more, and they began to talk about their doings during the holidays, where they had been, and what wonderful cricket they had played. A few new boys appeared, and with these presently Philip found himself talking. He was shy and nervous. He was anxious to make himself pleasant, but he could not think of anything to say. He was asked a great many questions and answered them all quite willingly. One boy asked him whether he could play cricket. "No," answered Philip. "I've got a club foot." The boy looked down quickly and reddened. Philip saw that he felt he had asked an unseemly question. He was too shy to apologize, and looked at Philip awkwardly. Chapter 11. Next morning, when the clanging of a bell awoke Philip, he looked round his cubicle in astonishment. Then a voice sang out, and he remembered where he was. "Are you awake, Singer?" The partitions of the cubicle were of polished pitch pine, and there was a great curtain in front. In those days there was little thought of ventilation, and the windows were closed except when the dormitory was aired in the morning. Philip got up and knelt down to say his prayers. It was a cold morning, and he shivered a little, but he had been taught by his uncle that his prayers were more acceptable to God if he said them in his nightshirt than if he waited till he was dressed. This did not surprise him, for he was beginning to realize that he was the creature of a God who appreciated the discomfort of his worshippers. Then he washed. There were 2 baths for the 50 boarders, and each boy had a bath once a week. The rest of the washing was done in a small basin on a washstand, which with the bed and the chair made up the furniture of each cubicle. The boys chatted gaily while they dressed. Philip was all ears. Then another bell sounded, and they ran downstairs. They took their seats on the forms on each side of the 2 long tables in the schoolroom, and Mr. Watson, followed by his wife and the servants, came in and sat down. Mr. Watson read prayers in an impressive manner, and the supplications thundered out in his loud voice as though they were threats personally addressed to each boy. Philip listened with anxiety. Then Mr. Watson read a chapter from the Bible, and the servants trooped out. In a moment the untidy youth brought in 2 large pots of tea, and on a second journey immense dishes of bread and butter. Philip had a squeamish appetite, and the thick slabs of poor butter on the bread turned his stomach, but he saw other boys scraping it off and followed their example. They all had potted meats and such like, which they had brought in their play boxes, and some had extras, eggs or bacon, upon which Mr. Watson made a profit. When he had asked Mr. Carey whether Philip was to have these, Mr. Carey replied that he did not think boys should be spoilt. Mr. Watson quite agreed with him. He considered nothing was better than bread and butter for growing lads, but some parents, unduly pampering their offspring, insisted on it. Philip noticed that extras gave boys a certain consideration, and made up his mind, when he wrote to Aunt Louisa, to ask for them. After breakfast the boys wandered out into the playground. Here the day boys were gradually assembling. They were sons of the local clergy, of the officers at the depot, and of such manufacturers or men of business as the old town possessed. Presently a bell rang, and they all trooped into school. This consisted of a large, long room at opposite ends of which 2 undermasters conducted the second and third forms, and of a smaller one leading out of it, used by Mr. Watson, who taught the first form. To attach the preparatory to the senior school, these 3 classes were known officially, on speech days and in reports, as upper, middle, and lower second. Philip was put in the last. The master, a red-faced man with a pleasant voice, was called Rice. He had a jolly manner with boys, and the time passed quickly. Philip was surprised when it was 11:15, and they were let out for 10 minutes' rest. The whole school rushed noisily into the playground. The new boys were told to go into the middle, while the others stationed themselves along opposite walls. They began to play pig in the middle. The old boys ran from wall to wall, while the new boys tried to catch them. When one was seized and the mystic words said, "1, 2, 3, and a pig for me," he became a prisoner, and, turning sides, helped to catch those who were still free. Philip saw a boy running past and tried to catch him, but his limp gave him no chance, and the runners, taking their opportunity, made straight for the ground he covered. Then one of them had the brilliant idea of imitating Philip's clumsy run. Other boys saw it and began to laugh. Then they all copied the first, and they ran round Philip, limping grotesquely, screaming in their treble voices with shrill laughter. They lost their heads with the delight of their new amusement, and choked with helpless merriment. One of them tripped Philip up, and he fell, heavily as he always fell, and cut his knee. They laughed all the louder when he got up. A boy pushed him from behind, and he would have fallen again if another had not caught him. The game was forgotten in the entertainment of Philip's deformity. One of them invented an odd, rolling limp that struck the rest as supremely ridiculous, and several of the boys lay down on the ground and rolled about in laughter. Philip was completely scared. He could not make out why they were laughing at him. His heart beat so that he could hardly breathe, and he was more frightened than he had ever been in his life. He stood still stupidly while the boys ran round him, mimicking and laughing. They shouted to him to try and catch them. But he did not move. He did not want them to see him run any more. He was using all his strength to prevent himself from crying. Suddenly the bell rang, and they all trooped back to school. Philip's knee was bleeding, and he was dusty and disheveled. For some minutes Mr. Rice could not control his form. They were excited still by the strange novelty, and Philip saw one or two of them furtively looking down at his feet. He tucked them under the bench. In the afternoon they went up to play football, but Mr. Watson stopped Philip on the way out after dinner. "I suppose you can't play football, Carey?" he asked him. Philip blushed self-consciously. "No, sir." "Very well, you'd better go up to the field. You can walk as far as that, can't you?" Philip had no idea where the field was, but he answered all the same. "Yes, sir." The boys went in charge of Mr. Rice, who glanced at Philip, and seeing he had not changed, asked why he was not going to play. "Mr. Watson said I needn't, sir," said Philip. "Why?" There were boys all round him, looking at him curiously, and a feeling of shame came over Philip. He looked down without answering. Others gave the reply. "He's got a club foot, sir." "Oh, I see." Mr. Rice was quite young. He had only taken his degree a year before, and he was suddenly embarrassed. His instinct was to beg the boys' pardon, but he was too shy to do so. He made his voice gruff and loud. "Now then, you boys, what are you waiting about for? Get on with you." Some of them had already started, and those that were left now set off in groups of 2 or 3. "You'd better come along with me, Carey," said the master. "You don't know the way, do you?" Philip guessed the kindness, and a sob came to his throat. "I can't go very fast, sir." "Then I'll go very slow," said the master with a smile. Philip's heart went out to the red-faced, commonplace young man who said a gentle word to him. He suddenly felt less unhappy. But at night, when they went up to bed and were undressing, the boy who was called Singer came out of his cubicle and put his head in Philip's. "I say, let's look at your foot," he said. "No," answered Philip. He jumped into bed quickly. "Don't say no to me," said Singer. "Come on, Mason." The boy in the next cubicle was looking round the corner, and at the words he slipped in. They made for Philip and tried to tear the bedclothes off him, but he held them tightly. "Why can't you leave me alone?" he cried. Singer seized a brush and with the back of it beat Philip's hands clenched on the blanket. Philip cried out. "Why don't you show us your foot quietly?" "I won't." In desperation, Philip clenched his fist and hit the boy who tormented him, but he was at a disadvantage, and the boy seized his arm. He began to turn it. "Oh, don't," said Philip. "You'll break my arm." "Stop still then, and put out your foot." Philip gave a sob and a gasp. The boy gave the arm another wrench. The pain was unendurable. "All right, I'll do it," said Philip. He put out his foot. Singer still kept his hand on Philip's wrist. He looked curiously at the deformity. "Isn't it beastly?" said Mason. Another came in and looked too. "Ugh!" he said in disgust. "My word, it is rum," said Singer, making a face. "Is it hard?" He touched it with the tip of his forefinger, cautiously, as though it were something that had a life of its own. Suddenly they heard Mr. Watson's heavy tread on the stairs. They threw the clothes back on Philip and dashed like rabbits into their cubicles. Mr. Watson came into the dormitory. Raising himself on tiptoe, he could see over the rod that bore the green curtain, and he looked into 2 or 3 of the cubicles. The little boys were safely in bed. He put out the light and went out. Singer called out to Philip, but he did not answer. He had got his teeth in the pillow so that his sobbing should be inaudible. He was not crying for the pain they had caused him, nor for the humiliation he had suffered when they looked at his foot, but with rage at himself because, unable to stand the torture, he had put out his foot of his own accord. And then he felt the misery of his life. It seemed to his childish mind that this unhappiness must go on forever. For no particular reason he remembered that cold morning when Emma had taken him out of bed and put him beside his mother. He had not thought of it once since it happened, but now he seemed to feel the warmth of his mother's body against his, and her arms around him. Suddenly it seemed to him that his life was a dream, his mother's death, and the life at the vicarage, and these 2 wretched days at school, and he would awake in the morning and be back again at home. His tears dried as he thought of it. He was too unhappy. It must be nothing but a dream, and his mother was alive, and Emma would come up presently and go to bed. He fell asleep. But when he awoke next morning, it was to the clanging of a bell, and the first thing his eyes saw was the green curtain of his cubicle. Chapter 12. As time went on, Philip's deformity ceased to interest. It was accepted like one boy's red hair and another's unreasonable corpulence. But meanwhile he had grown horribly sensitive. He never ran if he could help it, because he knew it made his limp more conspicuous, and he adopted a peculiar walk. He stood still as much as he could, with his club foot behind the other, so that it should not attract notice, and he was constantly on the lookout for any reference to it. Because he could not join in the games which other boys played, their life remained strange to him. He only interested himself from the outside in their doings, and it seemed to him that there was a barrier between them and him. Sometimes they seemed to think that it was his fault if he could not play football, and he was unable to make them understand. He was left a good deal to himself. He had been inclined to talkativeness, but gradually he became silent. He began to think of the difference between himself and others. The biggest boy in his dormitory, Singer, took a dislike to him, and Philip, small for his age, had to put up with a good deal of hard treatment. About halfway through the term a mania ran through the school for a game called nibs. It was a game for 2, played on a table or a form with steel pegs. You had to push your nib with the finger nail so as to get the point of it over your opponent's, while he maneuvered to prevent this, and to get the point of his nib over the back of yours. When this result was achieved, you breathed on the ball of your thumb, pressed it hard on the 2 nibs, and if you were able then to lift them without dropping either, both nibs became yours. Soon nothing was seen but boys playing this game, and the more skilful acquired vast stores of nibs. But in a little while Mr. Watson made up his mind that it was a form of gambling, forbade the game, and confiscated all the nibs in the boys' possession. Philip had been very adroit, and it was with a heavy heart that he gave up his winning, but his fingers itched to play still, and a few days later, on his way to the football field, he went into a shop and bought a pennyworth of J-pens. He carried them loose in his pocket and enjoyed feeling them. Presently Singer found out that he had them. Singer had given up his nibs too, but he had kept back a very large one called a jumbo, which was almost unconquerable, and he could not resist the opportunity of getting Philip's J's out of him. Though Philip knew that he was at a disadvantage with his small nibs, He had an adventurous disposition and was willing to take the risk. Besides, he was aware that Singer would not allow him to refuse. He had not played for a week and sat down to the game now with a thrill of excitement. He had lost 2 of his small nibs quickly, and Singer was jubilant. But the third time, by some chance, the jumbo slipped round and Philip was able to push his J across it. He crowed with triumph. At that moment Mr. Watson came in. "What are you doing?" he asked. He looked from Singer to Philip, but neither answered. "Don't you know that I've forbidden you to play that idiotic game?" Philip's heart beat fast. He knew what was coming and was dreadfully frightened, but in his fright there was a certain exultation. He had never been swished. Of course it would hurt, but it was something to boast about afterwards. "Come into my study." The headmaster turned and they followed him side by side. Singer whispered to Philip, "We're in for it." Mr. Watson pointed to Singer. "Bend over," he said. Philip, very white, saw the boy quiver at each stroke, and after the third he heard him cry out. 3 more followed. "That'll do. Get up." Singer stood up. The tears were streaming down his face. Philip stepped forward. Mr. Watson looked at him for a moment. "I'm not going to cane you. You're a new boy, and I can't hit a cripple. Go away, both of you, and don't be naughty again." When they got back into the schoolroom, a group of boys, who had learned in some mysterious way what was happening, were waiting for them. They set upon Singer at once with eager questions. Singer faced them, his face red with the pain and marks of tears still on his cheeks. He pointed with his head at Philip, who was standing a little behind him. "He got off because he's a cripple," he said angrily. Philip stood silent and flushed. He felt that they looked at him with contempt. "How many did you get?" one boy asked Singer. But he did not answer. He was angry because he had been hurt. "Don't ask me to play nibs with you again," he said to Philip. "It's jolly nice for you. You don't risk anything." "I didn't ask you." "Didn't you?" He quickly put out his foot and tripped Philip up. Philip was always rather unsteady on his feet, and he fell heavily to the ground. "Cripple," said Singer. For the rest of the term he tormented Philip cruelly, and though Philip tried to keep out of his way, the school was so small that it was impossible. He tried being friendly and jolly with him. He abased himself so far as to buy him a knife, but though Singer took the knife, he was not placated. Once or twice, driven beyond endurance, he hit and kicked the bigger boy, but Singer was so much stronger that Philip was helpless, and he was always forced after more or less torture to beg his pardon. It was that which rankled with Philip. He could not bear the humiliation of apologies which were wrung from him by pain greater than he could bear. And what made it worse was that there seemed no end to his wretchedness. Singer was only 11 and would not go to the upper school till he was 13. Philip realized that he must live 2 years with a tormentor from whom there was no escape. He was only happy while he was working and when he got into bed. And often there recurred to him then that queer feeling that his life with all its misery was nothing but a dream, and that he would awake in the morning in his own little bed in London. End of chapter 12. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.